Before we dive into one of history's most desperate sieges, let me ask you something. What do you know about the fall of Constantinople? Most people remember 1453, the cannons, the walls coming down, the end of the Roman Empire. But what came next? Because Mehmed the Conqueror didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Constantinople was the prize, but it was also the gateway. And 3 years later, in the summer of 1456, Mehmed turned his eyes toward the next domino, Belgrade. If it fell, there would be nothing between the Ottoman Empire and the heart of Christian Europe. No fortresses. No armies. Nothing. Just open roads leading straight to Vienna, to Rome, to everything. This is the story of how a dying kingdom, a 70-year-old general, and a fanatical monk with a cross in one hand and a sword in the other held the line when no one else would. 19 days. That's all it took. 19 days of cannon fire, desperation, blood, and one of the most insane counterattacks in military history. If this video teaches you something new, if it pulls you into the story, here's all I'm asking. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe. No algorithms, no tricks, just you telling YouTube this is the kind of content that matters. Now let's go back to 1456 and watch an empire try to break a city that refused to die. Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453. The walls that had stood for 1,000 years came down under the weight of Mehmed's cannons, and the Byzantine Empire ceased to exist. Europe was terrified. The Ottomans weren't just another empire, they were a war machine, disciplined, relentless, expanding in every direction. Mehmed was 21 years old when he took Constantinople. 21. And he wasn't done. He couldn't be done. Conquest wasn't just ambition for Mehmed, it was destiny. His nickname wasn't a marketing stunt. Mehmed the Conqueror meant it. The question wasn't if he would push into Europe. It was when. And the answer came fast. By 1454, Ottoman armies were raiding deep into Hungary, testing defenses, burning villages, taking prisoners. Mehmed was probing for weakness. And he found it. The Kingdom of Hungary was exhausted. Decades of war with the Ottomans had bled the country dry. King Ladislaus V was a teenager, barely 16, inexperienced, more concerned with internal politics than external threats. His court was dominated by rival factions, nobles fighting over land and titles while the Ottoman threat grew larger every day. The Hungarian nobility were divided, self-interested, more focused on their estates than the survival of the kingdom. There was no unity. No coordinated defense. No standing army ready to face what was coming. The coffers were empty. The fortresses were undermanned. The kingdom was rotting from within while an empire hammered at the gates. But there was one man. John Hunyadi. If you don't know that name, you should. Hunyadi was born sometime around 1406, the son of a Wallachian noble who had been granted lands in Transylvania. His origins were humble compared to the great magnates of Hungary, but Hunyadi didn't inherit his reputation. He earned it. Battle by battle. Victory by victory. For 30 years, he had fought the Ottomans. Not as a king or emperor, but as a general, a military governor, a man who understood that the survival of Christian Europe depended on holding the line in the Balkans. He had won at the Battle of Ialamata in 1442, smashing an Ottoman force that outnumbered him. He had led the long campaign, pushing deep into Ottoman territory, taking cities, shattering armies, proving that the Turks could be beaten. He had fought at Varna in 1444, one of the bloodiest battles of the century, where King Ladislaus III of Poland and Hungary was killed and the Hungarian army was nearly destroyed. Hunyadi survived. He always survived. And he always came back. He had fought at the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448, another disaster, another defeat, but Hunyadi escaped, regrouped, and kept fighting. By 1456, he was 70 years old. His hair was white. His body was breaking down. He suffered from gout, fevers, chronic pain. But his mind was sharp, and his will was iron. Hunyadi knew what was coming. He had been watching Mehmed for years, tracking the movements of the Ottoman armies, reading the reports from scouts and spies. He knew Constantinople had been the beginning, not the end. And he knew Belgrade was next. Hunyadi understood something that most European leaders didn't: geography was destiny. Let's talk about why Belgrade mattered so much. The city sits at the confluence of two rivers, the Danube and the Sava. The Danube is one of the great rivers of Europe, flowing from Germany through Austria, Hungary, and down into the Balkans before emptying into the Black Sea. Control the Danube, and you control trade, transportation, and military movement across half of Europe. The Sava flows from the west, through modern-day Slovenia and Croatia, joining the Danube at Belgrade. Together, these rivers formed a natural moat around the city on two sides. To the north, the Danube. To the west, the Sava. To the south and east, land, but land that was already under Ottoman control. Belgrade was a fortress by design, built on high ground overlooking the rivers, with thick medieval walls, towers, gates, and a citadel in the center. But more than that, Belgrade was a choke point. If the Ottomans took it, they would control the river system. They could move armies by boat, bypassing Hungarian fortresses, striking deep into the heartland without having to fight through every castle and town along the way. They could supply their forces indefinitely, using the rivers as highways. And most importantly, they would break the psychological barrier. Belgrade was the symbol of Christian resistance in the Balkans. If it fell, other cities would surrender without a fight. The dominoes would fall. Mehmed understood this. So did Hunyadi. That's why both men knew this siege would decide everything. In early 1456, the Ottomans began gathering their forces. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a punitive expedition. Mehmed was bringing the full weight of the empire. Sources vary on exact numbers, as they always do with medieval armies, but most historians agree, somewhere between 60 and 80,000 soldiers. Let me break down what that actually meant. First, the Janissaries. These were the elite infantry of the Ottoman army, taken as boys through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, trained from childhood in military discipline and combat. They were professional soldiers in an age when most armies were still feudal levies and part-time militia. They wore distinctive uniforms, carried matchlock arquebus and swords, fought in tight formations, and never broke ranks. They were fanatically loyal to the Sultan, and they were terrifyingly effective. Mehmed brought thousands of them to Belgrade. Then there were the Sipahi, the Ottoman heavy cavalry. These were the feudal warriors of the empire, granted land in exchange for military service, armored horsemen who could charge through infantry lines and run down fleeing enemies. They were deadly in open battle but less useful in siege warfare. Still, Mehmed brought them anyway, both for intimidation and to cut off any relief forces trying to reach the city. Beyond the professional soldiers, there were tens of thousands of irregulars, Azaps and Akinci, lightly armed troops used for skirmishing, raiding, and filling in the ranks during assaults. And then there were the laborers, engineers, sappers, miners, blacksmiths, carpenters, all the support personnel needed to run a massive siege operation. But the real terror came from the cannons. Mehmed had learned the power of artillery at Constantinople. He had employed Urban, a Hungarian cannon founder who had offered his services to the Byzantines first, been turned down because they couldn't afford him, and then gone to Mehmed, who paid him a fortune to build the largest cannons in the world. Urban's great bombard, the Basilica, fired stone balls weighing over half a ton and could smash through walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Urban himself died during the siege of Constantinople, but his legacy lived on. Mehmed's artillery corps had grown into the most advanced in the world. For Belgrade, he brought dozens of cannons, ranging from smaller field pieces to massive siege guns that required teams of oxen to move. These weren't just weapons. They were psychological terror devices. The sound alone, the deep, earth-shaking boom, the whistling scream of a stone ball hurtling through the air, the explosive crash when it hit stone, all of it was designed to break the will of defenders before the infantry even attacked. Medieval fortifications were built to withstand siege towers, battering rams, catapults. They were not built to withstand gunpowder artillery. The Ottomans also brought a fleet. Over 200 ships, a mix of war galleys and transport boats, controlling the Danube and Sava rivers, cutting off resupply, isolating Belgrade from the outside world. This was total war. Overwhelming force. Shock and awe. Mehmed wanted Belgrade crushed so decisively that no one would dare resist again. Inside Belgrade, the situation was desperate. The garrison was small. Estimates range from 5,000 to 7,000 men, and most of them were not professional soldiers. There were some knights, some experienced men-at-arms, veterans of previous campaigns, but the bulk of the defenders were local militia, townspeople, peasants from the surrounding countryside who had fled into the city when they heard the Ottomans were coming. They had spears, swords, axes, improvised weapons. They had courage but very little training. The fortifications were decent but aging. Belgrade's walls were medieval, built in the style of the 13th and 14th centuries, thick stone ramparts with towers spaced at regular intervals, gates reinforced with iron, a citadel in the center for last-ditch defense. But these walls were not designed to resist cannon fire. They had no angled bastions to deflect shots, no earthwork reinforcements to absorb the impact of heavy artillery. They were vertical, solid, and vulnerable. The city's commander was Michael Shalagi, Hunyadi's brother-in-law, a capable and experienced soldier who had fought alongside Hunyadi for years. Shalagi was a realist. He looked at the size of his garrison, the condition of the walls, the reports of the Ottoman army marching toward them, and he knew they couldn't hold. Not alone. Not against this. He sent desperate messages to King Ladislaus in Buda, to the Hungarian nobility, to anyone who would listen. We need reinforcements. We need supplies. We need help now. The response was pathetic. King Ladislaus did nothing. He was young, weak, easily manipulated by the factions at his court. Some nobles argued that Belgrade was already lost and that sending an army would just mean losing it too. Others were too busy scheming against each other to care about the Ottomans. No army was assembled. No relief force was sent. No supplies were dispatched. Belgrade was on its own. Except for two men, John Hunyadi and Giovanni da Capistrano. Hunyadi wasn't officially in command of anything in 1456. He had been regent of Hungary after King Ladislaus' death at Varna, effectively ruling the kingdom for years while Ladislaus was a child. But political enemies had maneuvered him out of power, jealous of his reputation, resentful of his influence. By 1456, Hunyadi held no royal office. He had no official title, no royal mandate, no standing army waiting for him. But he had something far more important: respect. When Hunyadi called for volunteers to march to Belgrade, men came. Not because a king ordered them. Not because they were paid. But because Hunyadi asked. Peasants left their fields. Townspeople left their workshops. Minor nobles gathered their retainers. They came from Transylvania, from Hungary, from the border regions that had been bleeding under Ottoman raids for decades. They came because they believed in Hunyadi. They came because he had never abandoned them. He scraped together maybe 15,000 men. Some sources say more, some say less, but the number doesn't really matter. What mattered was that they were almost entirely untrained. Most had never fought in a real battle. They had no armor, no standardized weapons, no military discipline. They were a mob. But they were a mob that refused to give up. And Hunyadi knew how to use them. Giovanni da Capistrano was 70 years old, a Franciscan friar who had spent most of his life as a preacher and inquisitor. He had been born in Italy in 1386, studied law, served as a judge, been imprisoned during a local war, and then, in a moment of religious awakening, abandoned his career, joined the Franciscan order, and devoted his life to preaching. And he was good at it. Really good. Capistrano traveled across Europe, delivering sermons that drew thousands, calling for moral reform, attacking heresy, and, increasingly, calling for a crusade against the Ottomans. After Constantinople fell, Capistrano became obsessed with the idea of a holy war. He preached in Germany, in Poland, in Hungary, telling anyone who would listen that the Ottomans were the enemies of Christ, the scourge of God, the darkness that had to be pushed back. And thousands believed him. Capistrano didn't look like a warrior. He was short, thin, frail, sickly, his body worn down by years of fasting and travel. But when he spoke, people listened. His voice carried. His words burned. He called the defense of Belgrade a holy mission, a test of faith, a chance to fight for God and Christendom. And men followed. Capistrano gathered his own army, separate from Hunyadi's, a ragtag force of peasants, craftsmen, farmers, people with no military training but absolute conviction. They carried crosses, banners with the name of Jesus embroidered in gold, improvised weapons, clubs, farm tools, whatever they could find. Historians call them crusaders, but that makes them sound more organized than they were. They were fanatics. Believers. Desperate men willing to die because a 70-year-old monk told them God demanded it. Capistrano and Hunyadi joined forces. It was an odd partnership. A pragmatic general who had spent his life studying tactics, logistics, and strategy, and a religious zealot with no military experience but unshakable faith. But it worked because they both understood one thing: if Belgrade fell, everything fell. There would be no second line of defense. No fallback position. It was here or nowhere. On July 4, 1456, Mehmed's army arrived at Belgrade. The Ottomans didn't waste time. They set up camp in a massive semicircle around the southern and eastern sides of the city, their tents stretching as far as the eye could see. Engineers began constructing siege works, wooden palisades, earthen embankments, platforms for the cannons. Sappers started digging trenches, moving closer to the walls under cover, preparing to undermine the foundations. The fleet moved into position on the rivers, cutting off escape and resupply. And then the bombardment began. The noise was unimaginable. Massive cannons roared, belching fire and smoke, hurling stone balls that weighed hundreds of pounds. The ground shook with each shot. The walls of Belgrade, thick medieval stone, began to crack. Towers shuddered. Battlements crumbled. Dust and smoke filled the air, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. The defenders crouched behind the walls, listening to the impacts, waiting for the stone to give way. Mehmed's plan was textbook Ottoman siege warfare. Surround the city. Cut off all resupply. Pound the walls with artillery until breaches opened. Send in the Janissaries to storm the gaps. Overwhelm the defenders with superior numbers and firepower. It was the same strategy that had worked at Constantinople. It should have worked here too. 4 days, the bombardment continued. Day and night, the cannons fired. The Ottomans worked in shifts, keeping up constant pressure, never letting the defenders rest, never giving them time to repair the damage. Slowly, methodically, the walls began to fail. Cracks widened into gaps. Gaps widened into breaches. Sections of wall collapsed entirely, leaving piles of rubble that could be climbed. The defenders did what they could. They built barricades behind the breaches, piling up wood, furniture, stones, anything to create a second line of defense. They hauled up rubble and used it to fill gaps. They worked through the night, exhausted, terrified, knowing that when the breaches were wide enough, the assault would come. But Belgrade had something Constantinople didn't in its final days: a relief force on the way. On July 14, Hunyadi arrived with his fleet. Calling it a fleet is generous. It was a collection of riverboats, commandeered barges, fishing vessels, anything that could float and carry men or supplies. But Hunyadi had loaded them with soldiers, weapons, food, gunpowder, everything the defenders needed. And he was going to force his way through the Ottoman blockade. The Ottoman fleet was waiting, over 200 war galleys lined up on the Danube, blocking the river, their commanders confident that no Christian force could break through. They were wrong. Hunyadi's flotilla came downriver in the afternoon, moving fast, using the current. The Ottomans moved to intercept, their galleys rowing out to form a line, archers and gunners ready to fire. And then the two fleets collided. It was chaos. Ships rammed into each other, grappling hooks flew, men leaped across decks, fighting hand to hand. Arrows filled the air. Gunfire cracked. Boats caught fire. Men drowned. Hunyadi was in the thick of it, directing the attack, his boat ramming an Ottoman galley, his men boarding, cutting down the crew. Other Christian boats followed, smashing through the line, overwhelming the Ottomans with sheer aggression. The Ottoman fleet tried to regroup, but Hunyadi didn't give them time. He kept pushing, kept attacking, kept moving forward. By evening, the Ottoman blockade was broken. Hunyadi sailed into Belgrade with supplies, reinforcements, and, most importantly, hope. The city wasn't alone anymore. When the garrison saw Hunyadi's boats arriving, they cheered. Men wept. They had been preparing to die, and now, suddenly, they had a chance. Hunyadi didn't waste time. He unloaded supplies, reinforced the defenses, organized the garrison, and sent messengers to Capistrano, who was camped outside the city with his crusader army, telling him to hold position and be ready to move. Mehmed was furious. The blockade was broken. His timetable was disrupted. The defenders had been reinforced. But he didn't retreat. He didn't reconsider. He doubled down. More cannons were brought forward. The bombardment intensified. Ottoman engineers worked around the clock, building siege towers, constructing assault ramps, preparing scaling ladders. Mehmed wanted this over. By late July, the walls were in ruins. Multiple breaches had been opened, wide gaps where the stone had collapsed, leaving piles of rubble that could be climbed by attacking infantry. The Ottoman commanders walked the perimeter, studying the defenses, identifying the weak points, planning the assault. And then, on July 21st, Mehmed gave the order. At dawn, the attack began. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers surged forward, wave after wave, climbing over the rubble, pouring through the breaches, fighting their way into the city. The Janissaries led the assault, disciplined, relentless, advancing in tight formations, their officers shouting orders, keeping them together even as Christian defenders threw everything they had at them. Arrows, stones, boiling water, anything. The Janissaries didn't stop. They climbed the rubble. They pushed through the barricades. They fought hand-to-hand in the narrow streets behind the walls. Behind them came the irregulars, thousands of Azaps and Akinci, flooding into the breaches, overwhelming the defenders with sheer numbers. The fighting was brutal. No neat lines. No organized formations. Just chaos, blood, and desperation. Hunyadi was everywhere. He moved from breach to breach, rallying the defenders, leading counterattacks, fighting in the rubble with a sword in his hand. At 70 years old, sick, exhausted, he refused to stay in the rear. He couldn't. The defense was collapsing. Sections of the city were overrun. Ottoman banners were planted on the walls. Janissaries were pushing deeper into the streets. It looked like Belgrade would fall. Capistrano was on the walls, holding up a cross, screaming prayers, trying to inspire men who were breaking, who were running, who were ready to give up. He shouted at them, called them cowards, told them God was watching, told them this was their moment of redemption. And somehow, impossibly, some of them listened. Some of them stopped running. Some of them turned around and went back into the fight. Hunyadi launched a desperate counterattack. He pulled together every reserve he had, every man who could still hold a weapon, and threw them at the Janissaries who had penetrated deepest into the city. It was reckless. It was brutal. It was the only option. The two sides collided in the streets, stabbing, clubbing, clawing at each other. No strategy. No tactics. Just raw, desperate violence. And slowly, step by bloody step, the Ottomans were pushed back. The Janissaries fought harder than any troops Hunyadi had ever faced, but they were tired, they were in unfamiliar terrain, and they were being attacked from all sides. The irregulars behind them began to waver. Some broke and ran. Others were cut off and surrounded. By midday, the Ottoman assault was faltering. Hunyadi kept pushing. He retook the breaches. He drove the Ottomans back over the rubble, back outside the walls. By late afternoon, the attack had failed. The Ottomans retreated, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead piled in the breaches. Mehmed watched from his command tent, furious, humiliated. His best troops had been repulsed. But he wasn't done. He would try again. The defenders had held. Barely. But they had held. That night, inside Belgrade, The exhaustion was total. Men collapsed where they stood. The streets were littered with bodies. The walls were on fire in places. Smoke hung over the city like a shroud. Hunyadi walked through the ruins, checking on the wounded, speaking to the soldiers, trying to keep morale from collapsing entirely. He knew they couldn't survive another assault like that. The garrison was shattered. Supplies were running low. The walls were gone. If Mehmed attacked again tomorrow, they would break. But Hunyadi also knew something Mehmed didn't. Capistrano's crusader army was still camped outside the city, across the river, waiting. Thousands of men, untrained but fanatical, ready to fight. Hunyadi had told Capistrano to wait, to hold position, to not do anything reckless. But Capistrano wasn't good at following orders. The next day, July 22nd, Capistrano did something absolutely insane. He decided he was done with defense. He gathered his crusaders, thousands of peasants and townspeople armed with clubs, axes, scythes, whatever they had, and he told them they were going to attack. Not defend. Attack. They were going to charge out of the city, straight into the Ottoman camp, and drive the infidels back. It was suicidal. It was insane. It was exactly the kind of reckless fanaticism that Hunyadi had been trying to avoid. But Capistrano didn't ask permission. He didn't coordinate with Hunyadi. He just did it. He led his crusaders out of the gates, holding his cross high, screaming prayers, and thousands of half-armed fanatics followed him, charging across the open ground toward the Ottoman siege lines. Hunyadi saw what was happening and completely lost his mind. This wasn't strategy. This wasn't tactics. This was mass suicide. Capistrano was going to get himself and thousands of men killed, and there was nothing Hunyadi could do to stop it. Except follow. Because if he didn't, Capistrano's crusaders would die alone. So Hunyadi did the only thing he could. He grabbed every soldier he had left, organized them into a proper fighting force, and charged out after Capistrano. What happened next was one of the most chaotic, improbable, and decisive battles in medieval history. Capistrano's crusaders smashed into the Ottoman siege lines like a human avalanche. They didn't fight with discipline. They didn't fight with tactics. They fought with pure, insane aggression. They didn't care about formations. They didn't care about defense. They just kept coming, screaming, swinging their weapons, throwing themselves at the Ottoman soldiers. The Ottomans were caught completely off guard. They had been preparing for another siege assault, setting up artillery, organizing their infantry, expecting the Christians to stay behind their walls and defend. They were not prepared for a sudden, massive counterattack. Their camp was in disarray. Their cannons weren't positioned for defense. Soldiers were scattered, some eating, some resting, some working on siege equipment. And then thousands of screaming crusaders were among them, smashing through tents, attacking supply wagons, setting fires. It was chaos. The Janissaries tried to regroup, forming defensive lines, but Capistrano's men didn't stop. They crashed into the Janissaries, died by the dozens, and kept coming. And then Hunyadi's trained soldiers hit them next. Hunyadi had organized his men into disciplined formations, cavalry and infantry working together, exploiting the chaos, cutting through Ottoman supply lines, targeting command positions, turning the Ottoman camp into a slaughterhouse. Mehmed tried to rally his troops. He rode into the battle himself, shouting orders, trying to restore order, but his soldiers were panicking. The camp was burning. Christian forces were everywhere. And then the unthinkable happened. Mehmed himself was wounded. Accounts vary on exactly how it happened. Some sources say an arrow hit him in the leg. Others say he was struck by a spear or a sword during close combat. Either way, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who had sworn to take Belgrade, was hit and had to be evacuated from the battlefield. His bodyguards surrounded him, pulled him back, carried him to safety. And when the Ottoman troops saw their Sultan being carried away, bleeding, possibly dying, morale collapsed. Panic spread like wildfire. Units broke. Men threw down their weapons and ran. The retreat turned into a rout. Soldiers trampled each other, trying to escape. The Christian forces pursued, cutting down fleeing Ottomans, capturing prisoners, seizing supplies. Hunyadi kept his men organized, pushing forward, driving the Ottomans away from the city, away from their siege works, away from their cannons. By the end of the day, the Ottoman army was in full retreat. The siege was over. Belgrade had held. The victory was total, shocking, and catastrophic for the Ottomans. Estimates suggest they lost somewhere between 20 and 30,000 men, including thousands of elite janissaries, the best-trained soldiers in the empire, irreplaceable veterans who had fought in dozens of campaigns. Mehmed's grand cannons, the same weapons that had shattered the walls of Constantinople, were abandoned in the retreat. The Christian forces captured them, along with hundreds of supply wagons, weapons, tents, banners, everything the Ottomans left behind in their panic. It was the first major Ottoman defeat since Constantinople fell. And it changed everything. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was shattered. Mehmed the Conqueror, the unstoppable sultan who had taken the greatest city in the world, had been beaten by a ragtag army of peasants and one dying general. The psychological impact was enormous. Across Europe, church bells rang in celebration. Pope Calixtus III, who had been calling for a crusade for years, declared the victory a miracle, a sign that God had not abandoned Christendom. He ordered that church bells be rung at noon every day to commemorate the victory and to call Christians to prayer for the defense of Europe. That tradition continued for centuries in many places, long after most people had forgotten why the bells rang. But the cost was brutal. Hunyadi survived the battle but contracted plague during the siege. The disease had spread through the camps, both Christian and Ottoman, thriving in the filth and crowding of a siege. Hunyadi fell ill within days of the victory. He tried to fight it, tried to stay on his feet, but his body, already weakened by age and battle, couldn't recover. He died on August 11, 1456, less than 3 weeks after saving Belgrade. 70 years old, sick, exhausted, but he lived just long enough to see the city saved. Just long enough to know that he had won. Giovanni da Capistrano died a few months later, in October 1456, also from plague. The fanatical monk who had charged into the Ottoman camp with a cross in his hand never saw the full consequences of what he had accomplished. But he died believing he had done God's work, believing that the victory was divine intervention, believing that his faith had moved mountains. Both men, the general and the monk, the pragmatist and the zealot, were buried as heroes. Capistrano was later canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, Saint John of Capistrano, the patron saint of military chaplains and jurists. Hunyadi was never made a saint, but in Hungary he became something more, a legend, the last great defender of Christendom, the man who stood between Europe and the Ottoman tide and refused to break. The two men who held the line didn't live to see the full consequences of what they accomplished. But those consequences were enormous. Mehmed the Conqueror never took Belgrade. He tried again later, smaller campaigns, probing attacks, but he never brought the full weight of his empire back to that city. The momentum was broken. The myth of invincibility was shattered. And Europe, fractured and divided as it was, had bought itself time. Time to regroup. Time to fortify. Time to prepare for the next wave. Here's what you need to understand about why this siege matters. This wasn't just one city holding out. This was the collapse of Mehmed's entire strategy. After Constantinople, the plan was clear. Push north through the Balkans, take the Danube fortresses one by one, roll into Hungary, destabilize Central Europe, force the Habsburgs to react, keep expanding while Europe was weak and divided. Belgrade was step one. It was the linchpin. If it fell, the Danube was open. If the Danube was open, nothing stood between the Ottomans and Vienna. Nothing between them and the Holy Roman Empire. Nothing between them and Rome itself. When Belgrade held, the whole timeline shifted. Mehmed had to spend the next decade securing his southern and eastern borders, dealing with rebellions in Anatolia, consolidating his hold on the Balkans, fighting wars in the Caucasus and the Crimea. He still conquered. He took Trebizond in 1461, the last Greek holdout on the Black Sea. He took Bosnia in the 1460s, expanding Ottoman control in the Western Balkans. He fought wars with Venice, with Persia, with the Mamluks. But he never achieved the rapid European expansion he wanted after Constantinople. The window closed. And it closed because a 70-year-old general and a fanatic monk refused to let it stay open. Historians argue about the long-term impact of Belgrade. Some say it just delayed the inevitable, that the Ottomans came back stronger in the 16th century under Suleiman the Magnificent, took most of Hungary, besieged Vienna twice, in 1529 and 1683, and that Belgrade was just a temporary setback. Others argue that the delay mattered, that those extra decades allowed the Habsburg Empire to consolidate power in Austria and Germany, allowed European military technology to catch up to the Ottomans, allowed the Protestant Reformation to fracture Europe in ways that actually strengthened resistance to outside threats, changed the entire trajectory of the Ottoman-European conflict. Both interpretations have merit. The Ottomans did come back. They did take Hungary. They did besiege Vienna. But they never achieved the same momentum they had in 1453. They never broke through into Central Europe the way Mehmed had envisioned. And by the time they reached Vienna in 1529, the window had closed. The Habsburgs were ready. The fortifications were stronger. The armies were larger. The balance of power had shifted. Belgrade bought time. And in history, time matters. I'm not here to tell you which interpretation is right. I'm here to tell you what happened. And what happened was this. In the summer of 1456, when the Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power, when Mehmed the Conqueror was considered unstoppable, when every informed observer believed Belgrade was doomed, a ragtag army of peasants, volunteers, and one dying general held a city that everyone thought was lost. They fought in breaches, on walls, in the rubble of collapsing towers. They endured 19 days of bombardment, starvation, disease, and terror. They repelled a massive assault by the best infantry in the world. And then, in an act of reckless, suicidal bravery, they launched a counterattack so insane it shouldn't have worked. And they won. Let's talk about what happened to the major players after Belgrade. Mehmed recovered from his wound. It wasn't life-threatening, and within weeks, he was back in command. But the defeat haunted him. He never forgot Belgrade. He never forgave the loss. For the rest of his reign, he focused on expansion in other directions, south into Greece, east into Anatolia, west into the Adriatic. He fought the Venetians for years, taking their colonies in the Aegean. He conquered the empire of Trebizond, the last Byzantine successor state. He pushed into the Crimea, forcing the Crimean Khanate into vassalage. He became one of the greatest conquerors in history, expanding the Ottoman Empire to its largest extent up to that point. But he never took Hungary. He never broke through the Danube line. And when he died in 1481, at the age of 49, Belgrade was still in Christian hands. King Ladislaus V of Hungary did absolutely nothing during the siege. He stayed in Buda, safe behind his walls, listening to his advisors argue, and watched as Hunyadi saved the kingdom without any royal support. After the victory, Ladislaus tried to take credit, issuing proclamations, holding celebrations, acting as if he had led the defense. No one was fooled. The Hungarian nobility knew who had saved them. When Hunyadi died of plague, Ladislaus saw an opportunity to eliminate the Hunyadi family as a political threat. He had Hunyadi's eldest son, Ladislaus Hunyadi, arrested on false charges of treason and executed in 1457. It was a cowardly, vindictive act, and it backfired spectacularly. The Hungarian nobility were outraged. Ladislaus V's reputation was destroyed. He died later that year, at the age of 17, possibly of leukemia, possibly poisoned. No one mourned him. Hunyadi's younger son, Matthias Corvinus, eventually became king of Hungary in 1458, ruling for over 30 years and turning Hungary into one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. He never forgot what his father had done at Belgrade. Michael Szilágyi, the commander of Belgrade's garrison, survived the siege and continued to serve Hungary for years. He became one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom, supporting Matthias Corvinus's claim to the throne, fighting in wars against the Ottomans, against the Habsburgs, against rival Hungarian factions. He died in 1461, still fighting, still defending the kingdom his brother-in-law had saved. The city of Belgrade itself remained in Christian hands for another 60 years. It became a symbol, a fortress that had defied the Ottomans, a rallying point for resistance. But in 1521, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans came back. This time, there was no Hunyadi, no Capistrano, no miracle. The city fell after a siege of several weeks, and the Ottomans held it for the next 2 centuries. But even then, the memory of 1456 remained. The story of the siege was told and retold, in songs, in chronicles, in sermons. It became part of the collective memory of Christian Europe, a reminder that even against impossible odds, resistance was possible. That empires could be stopped. That individuals mattered. Pope Calixtus III didn't live to see the long-term effects of the victory he had celebrated. He died in 1458, 2 years after Belgrade, but his order to ring church bells at noon in commemoration of the victory continued. In many Catholic regions, the Angelus bell, rung at noon, originated from this decree. Most people who heard it over the centuries had no idea it was connected to a siege in 1456. But the tradition survived, a faint echo of a moment when Europe came within inches of collapsing and didn't. The victory at Belgrade didn't end the Ottoman-European conflict. Far from it. The wars continued for centuries. The Ottomans expanded into Hungary, into the Mediterranean, into North Africa. They besieged Vienna twice. They fought the Habsburgs, the Venetians, the Poles, the Russians, in endless wars that stretched from the 15th century to the 20th. But the trajectory changed. After Belgrade, the Ottomans were no longer seen as invincible. They were powerful, yes. Dangerous, absolutely. But not unstoppable. And that psychological shift mattered. It meant that European states were willing to resist, willing to fight, willing to believe that victory was possible. Belgrade proved that. 1 siege. 19 days. 2 old men who refused to surrender. And an empire's momentum broken. If this story moved you, if it taught you something, if it reminded you that history isn't inevitable, that it's made by decisions, by individuals, by moments where everything hangs in the balance, then do me a favor. Like this video. Comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me what siege, what battle, what forgotten moment of history you want covered next. Tell me if you see the parallels, if you see the patterns, if you understand why these stories matter. Because they do matter. They matter because they show us that the world we live in, the borders, the nations, the cultures, the religions, all of it was shaped by moments like Belgrade. Moments when a handful of people made choices that changed everything. Mehmed could have retreated after the first assault failed. He didn't. Hunyadi could have stayed in Transylvania, safe, watching from a distance. He didn't. Capistrano could have stayed behind his pulpit, preaching instead of fighting. He didn't. Each of them made a choice. And those choices, multiplied across thousands of soldiers, across 19 days of battle, across 1 desperate siege, changed the course of history. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're telling stories like this, stories that matter, stories that textbooks gloss over or ignore completely. Stories about real people making impossible choices under unimaginable pressure. This channel doesn't do fluff. No filler. No padding. No 10-minute videos stretched to hit the algorithm. Just the facts, the blood, the decisions, and the consequences. That's the promise. And if you made it this far, if you've been with me for the last 30+ minutes, you already know whether this is for you. So hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who loves history, someone who's tired of shallow content, someone who wants to understand how the world actually works. And let's keep digging into the moments that shaped everything. Because there are more. So many more. Battles where empires fell. Sieges where cities refused to break. Generals who changed the world. Soldiers who held the line when no one else would. We're just getting started. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.